Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event here at Vanderbilt as part of our Democracy and Unity Project. I'm really delighted to see everyone here, and I'm really delighted about the conversation we're going to have today. So my name is Kevin Stack. I'm on the faculty of the Vanderbilt Law School, and I'll be moderating the panel today and have the pleasure of talking with both Major Garrett and David Becker about their important new book, Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. Major Garrett is Chief Washington Correspondent for CBS News. He's the creator and host of the Takeout podcast, among other things. And as a journalist and a writer, he's been asking tough questions to American leadership for more than 30 years. David Becker is the executive director and founder of the nonpartisan and nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. He has previously served as the director of elections at Pew Charitable Trust and also worked for 7 years as a trial attorney in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Major and David have paired up to write a book for exactly our moment. And this is a tough love book. It's a tough love for America book. As much as we might want to move on from the election denialism of 2020, I don't think we can. And the book shows us why this was a moment of maximum peril for our democracy and why we need to see it and how we need to understand it. At the same time, the book has a lot to celebrate in our system and in the people and the elections workers in our system. And you can feel their hopefulness in how they treat the election workers and election officials in the book. So thank you for the book, and it's a real pleasure to have this time together. So let me just start with, I know that David had been pulled into some work you were doing, Major, in CBS News. And I'd love to start with the question, Will, when did you decide this is a book we need to write?
That's the perfect question, Kevin. And first of all, thank you so much for being here. What a lovely crowd, especially on this treacherous morning of school delaying weather. Really, thank you for being here. We're deeply gratified by your presence. We really are. The first presidential campaign I covered was 1992. And I've covered or been an editor for every presidential campaign since then. And in 2020, when we were all experiencing lockdown, it occurred to me that the 2020 campaign was going to be unlike any other I had ever covered. And in July of that year, I went to CBS and I said, look, you're not going to need any road reporters for this campaign. Most of the reporting will be done from our couches because most of the events will be done virtually. I said, so the story of this election is going to be election administration, how we vote, how we cast and count votes, and how do we adapt to all the various things we're going to have to adapt to, trying to hold a national election in the midst of a global pandemic with no vaccines. Remember, that was the reality we were living in the summer of 2020. And it took me about 6 weeks to convince my network that this was even a story. They're like, what are you talking about? We're just going to do it like we always did. I'm like, no, we're not going to do it the way we always done it. We're going to have new rules, new methods, new precinct places, and we're going to have to explain to people how this process is going to play out. And they're like, those are terrible TV stories. What are you going to show me pictures of? Stacks of paper, machines that nobody's using, lines that don't exist? I'm like, you give me the assignment, I'll figure out how to tell the story on television. And that brought me into contact very quickly with David, who was our election law expert. And so he and I started having these conversations, and I put more stories on CBS News, both evening news and morning news, than had ever been before in the history of the network, before an election, on election procedures. Yeah. And were they the most visually interesting stories? No, but they were really important. And we had people who were explaining how they were going to do different things in different places under different sets of rules. Because I just knew intuitively this is where this election was going to come down to, one way or the other. And then, of course, as soon as President Trump started saying in the summer, about the same time, that the only way he could lose is if the election was rigged, I'm like, okay, we've now really made this an important question. And so that's how David and I started getting to know one another. The election plays out. Then there's January 6th, and then he and I are like, we've got to do something. Yeah. And the phrase I've used more than once is, to use your phrase, this is a book that David and I simply had to write. We just wish we didn't have to write it.
Yeah. I mean, I came at this from a slightly different perspective because this is the work I've been doing for 25 years. I started the Justice Department 25 years ago, and when I started, I would show up in election offices, and that was never a good thing for the election officials when the Department of Justice is coming to visit. I was not a popular person in those offices at the time, and I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, you know, if you're a litigator, if you're in law enforcement, you know, every problem is fixed by a lawsuit, right? Litigation is the only tool in your toolbox. And I quickly learned that that was not an effective tool all the time, because all of these election officials, almost every single one of them was trying to do the right thing with limited resources, with little support. They wanted to comply with the law. They just didn't really understand how to sometimes. The law can be very complex. And I came to really know and understand their work and appreciate it in a way that has really led me to this career. If you ask election officials, and go find your local election official, and first of all, give them a hug, they need it. But secondly, what you'll find is if you ask them, how'd you get started in this field? None of them got started in election administration because they went to college and studied to be an election administrator. They didn't join the little election officials club in high school. They mostly came to it by accident. They mostly answered a job announcement and applied for the job and got it. And once they got there, they found a calling. You'll hear this consistently from them. The ones who are there are doing it because they feel like they're serving some sacred duty, and that's really important to them. It doesn't matter if they're conservative Republicans or liberal Democrats. That duty is about giving voice to their voters. And they were struggling during the pandemic, because planning for an election is not something you can do while socially distant. We all had hopefully most of us had the ability to stay somewhat socially distant from others, keep ourselves safe. When you're planning for a major presidential election, you're in the office. You're working with machines, you're finding polling places, you're training poll workers. Some of that's being done virtually, but the trainers can't all do it virtually. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of them were getting sick. They were having struggles trying to figure out how to provide a safe and convenient voting experience for all their voters. We remember some problems during the primary process. But the thing that was really remarkable is somehow they managed the highest turnout in American history by far, both by percentage and by numbers. 20 million more voters showed up in the 2020 general election than had ever shown up for any election in American history. 20 million more. And we did that during a global pandemic, pre-vaccines. To be perfectly honest, we didn't even understand that much about how the disease was transmitted. If you think back to November of 2020, they somehow accomplished all that. And then what really drove us, I think, to write the book after that is, after that great success, one of the greatest successes of the democratic process in history, not because of the outcome, because of the process, they were attacked. These civil servants who quietly and often anonymously run our elections.
Has anyone here been a poll worker? Raise your hand. Okay, thank you very much. The only reason I asked that is I grew up in San Diego, California, and my mother was an executive with AT&T, and so was my father. But the unusual part for a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s was that mom was an executive. And my mom was a busy person, but she was a poll worker for 25 years. She always took off from work to work every election in our neighborhood, and that meant going up the street to a garage, which was our voting precinct, a garage. And my mom told me two things. She did that because that was, she thought, her civic duty, and that's how she kept up with the neighborhood. She was too busy to keep up with the neighborhood any other way, but if she worked the polls 3 times a year, usually, at least twice, she'd see people come in and learn about new births or deaths or marriages or whatever, and that's how she kept up with the neighborhood. In 2020, my eldest daughter became a poll worker. She was one of the 400,000 Americans who, for the first time, became poll workers to fill in for those who opted out. Why did they opt out? Because they were aged 60, 70, and 80, which is most of our poll workers in this country, the most vulnerable population during the pandemic. So my then 25-year-old daughter became a poll worker, not only because she thought it was her civic duty, but as a love note to her grandmother, my mother. And so this is a very deeply personal thing for me, the work that everyday Americans do in furtherance of this larger cause that has nothing to do with their ideology, it has only to do with making sure this system works, is stood up every time there's an election, not just when there's a headline-grabbing election, but every election, and they're there. And they do good work. And we wanted to, at least in part, have a component of this book that was a thank you to them and a recognition of them.
And that really comes through. You say, our politics may be broken, unfortunately, but our elections are not. And you feel that resonance throughout the book. At the same time, I think the book also describes how we had a kind of near-miss scenario in 2020. And I guess whether you could talk a little bit about what made the difference, and maybe this is just to kind of continue the thought about who are some heroes. You point to some heroes in the book that really made the difference. So there's kind of either part of that.
So I think one of the things, and you started off the question with this, is first you have to have a recognition of what the reality is. And the reality is that our elections are secure, verified, and transparent as they've ever been in American history. That doesn't mean they aren't going to continue to get better. They are going to continue to get better. But they're as good as they've ever been for some really clear reasons we talk about in the book. We have more paper ballots than ever before. Tennessee is actually one of the few states that doesn't have all paper ballots. But 95% of all voters in the United States vote on auditable, verifiable, recountable paper ballots. That includes every ballot in every battleground state in 2020. 95%. It was only 75% in 2016, which was also a secure election, by the way.
Yep.
We have no evidence of anything to the contrary. I said it at the time. The 2016 election, Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016 legitimately by winning a majority of votes in states that comprise a majority of the Electoral College. That's how those are the rules. Both campaigns knew those rules going into it. You don't have to like the rules. If you have the best field goal kicker in the league, you might want field goals to be worth 5 points. But that's not how it works. So those are the rules, and in 2020, we can be even more secure in knowing that those paper ballots, audits, which we have more of than ever before, court and other review, the most transparency we've ever had, worked. And yet, these heroes that we were talking about nevertheless found themselves under attack. And whether it's, Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, the Secretary of State there, Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, down to county election officials like Al Schmidt in Philadelphia, the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors in Arizona, whether it's poll workers, like the two poll workers in Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss in Fulton County, Georgia. And we highlight some others. I'll let you talk about some of the others that you interviewed. But there were people, and it wasn't just in the battleground states. There were people in California, in Texas, in Utah, as we point out, in other states where they did remarkable jobs. And we're sitting here today, I believe we're about 820 days since the November 2020 election. You can look it up. Might be just 818 or so, but it's close to there. And those election officials are still under constant siege. They're still under threats and harassment. The Cochise County, Arizona clerk just had to resign last week because of constant harassment she was facing. This is still happening right now as we're sitting here today.
Yeah. It's a traumatizing experience for folks, and it need not be. It really doesn't need to be. And we say this in the book very clearly. If you have questions about how we do this, we encourage all questions. Because even someone like me, who was a national political reporter, has been since 1990. That was my first campaign. That was a midterm election. But my first presidential campaign, as I said, was 1992. All that time, I didn't know that much about this process. I just assumed it worked. There was this sort of self-replicating thing. And I didn't understand how we really did it. I just knew we did it. And I knew that the calmest day, the most relaxing day in any campaign year was Election Day. Because there was nothing left for me to do. And guess what? There's nothing left for the candidates to do either. Or the fundraisers, or anyone. You just sit around. What do you sit around for? What are the people going to say? What are the people going to say? And how do we find that out? By people who do this work. And I had taken it for granted my entire career as a national political reporter. And I really fault myself for that. I really consider that like a massive error on my part, a huge blind spot. Just assuming this work would always be done, and this quiet, leisurely election day that I had experienced countless times in my career, which is sort of baked into the cake. It's not baked into the cake. It's hard work that takes months and months of planning. People don't show up the Monday before Election Day to get this stuff up and running. They've always had a primary, and they were months planning that primary. And then as soon as that primary ended, they got to the business of planning and making sure everything would be as seamless as possible on Election Day. And for the most part in our country, it has been. And I took all of this for granted, and I shouldn't have. And that's another part of my own journey in this process. And I do fault myself. Like, how could I be so indifferent to this thing that was so essential to what I would spend 2 years doing, covering a national campaign?
First of all, you shouldn't fault yourself. I mean, it is a...
I feel bad about it.
Probably a lot of people in this room, even as high information as we all are, I mean, I do this every day. This is my job. I've been doing this for 25 years. I know how a lot of the things work. Everyone else has other things going on. And elections are very esoteric and hard to understand. And by the way, different counties do it differently, different states do it differently. And to some degree, that lack of knowledge, which I think is actually understandable, I don't expect everyone to be an election expert, is leveraged by election deniers to kind of breed distrust in the system. And a great example of that is the claims about how long it takes to count ballots. Think back to, let's say, the 2008 presidential election. The media declared Barack Obama the winner at about 8 p.m. and 1 second Pacific time on election night, because that's when the results started coming in from the West Coast states, all of which went for Obama. Did we know who won the presidency at that point in time? We actually didn't. We just thought we did, because we're not really critically thinking about how the process works. The states were weeks away from certifying those results. The Electoral College was weeks after that away from having the results sent to the National Archives, and we were then weeks more away from the joint session of Congress, which is when we actually know who wins the presidency. And so the election deniers will use our understandable desire to want to know who won. I want to know who won, as soon as the polls close. Everyone does. And they use it against us by creating these false expectations, when if we really think about it and understand the process, of course it's going to take weeks to count all of the ballots. We want it to take weeks. There might be mail ballots that were received at the last minute. We want those validated, don't we? We don't want them just ripping them open and counting them. We want them to confirm they came from the right person. We want members of the military who sent their ballots in, and they often come days or even weeks later. We want those people to have a voice in our democracy. So of course it's going to take weeks to count those ballots, and then audit those ballots, and if necessary, recount those ballots before we certify the election. But it's a great example of how a lack of understanding about this really esoteric process can be leveraged against us.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I kind of want to touch on some of the ways in which, though, post-2020, some of these dynamics were happening pre-2020, of course, how they're kind of playing out. And one area you focus on the book is Secretaries of State. Mm-hmm. And you say Secretaries of State are the highest election officials in many states responsible for running elections. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And you say that now Secretary of State elections are attracting more and more campaign donations. So 3 times the Secretary of State elections were 3 times the amount of campaign donations as in 2018, and 8 times as they attracted in 2014. So I wonder if you can help us understand what's driving that trend, and is it concerning? Should we be concerned about that?
Well, in 2020, there were some deniers who ran for positions of Secretary of State, and almost all of them lost, right?
22, yeah.
22, yeah. 22, sorry. They lost. But that was an interesting moment for this country. Like, I'm running to run elections, and I deny that the last election was legitimate, when it was. Like, that presented a pretty stark question. And the voters rendered a verdict in Michigan by a substantial margin, in Nevada, in Arizona. Like, no, that's a bridge too far. That's not something we're going to embrace, and we're not going to empower you to have this kind of influence over future elections if you can't get right on what happened in the most previous election. And the idea of donations is parties now regard this as a place of power, as a leverage point, which they never did before. They simply didn't. But this is part of a larger concept in American politics where statewide offices now are viewed much more importantly by national parties and grassroots donors than they used to be. All that money used to flow to the federal races. But people are now saying, wait, states can do their own things, and states are doing their own things, especially in states like Tennessee on the red side, but there are blue states like California and New York that are trifecta states. Governor, House, and Senate, all the same party. Well, if you have agenda items that you want to either put on the national agenda or change a state and its relationship to its neighbors, these positions become much more important. And they're attracting much more political muscle and donations. And that's true of governors, lieutenant governors, attorney generals, and secretaries of state.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, Tennessee is one of the rare states that doesn't elect their chief election official. It is elected by the legislature in Tennessee, the Secretary of State here. There's New Hampshire does it similarly. There are a few states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Florida and Texas where the Secretary of State is appointed by the governor. But many of them are elected. And I'll say first, one of the problems we don't have in this country is that elected secretaries of state or chief election officials are putting the thumb on the scale for their own party. That is almost never happening, rather. There were Republican candidates who complained about Katie Hobbs, the Secretary of State of Arizona, overseeing the election that she was herself on the ballot for. That happens all the time. You didn't hear Republicans complaining about that when Brian Kemp, who was sitting Secretary of State, oversaw the elections in Georgia in 2018. And by the way, both of them performed admirably in that role. So we don't really have that problem. But what we're starting to see, and by the way, this is not a single party problem. This is something that's across the political spectrum because a lot of those donations are coming on the Democratic side. And it's because it's perceived that this election administration portfolio of work is now someplace where you could put your thumb on your scale to help your party. And fortunately, the voters rejected that. And it wasn't just voters rejecting it by electing Democrats over election-denying Republicans. It was also voters rejecting it in Republican primaries in states like Georgia, where they renominated Brad Raffensperger as their nominee over an election denier in that primary. Unfortunately, that wasn't a common thing in Republican primaries this past election cycle, but it is something that happened in some places. So voters don't want that position to be held by someone who thinks their job is to get their party elected. Voters want people who are going to give them a voice. For those of you that served as poll workers, you probably were in your polling place when you knew one of your neighbors came in who you don't agree with politically came in to vote. That probably made you at least as proud, if not even more proud, that you got to serve in that role. And I can tell you for most election officials around the country, that's the way they feel. They feel it's fantastic when everyone in their community gets to have an opportunity to vote. The Republican election officials are not trying to prevent people from voting in almost every case, and the Democratic election officials are not trying to invite fraud in to get their person elected. That's not what we're seeing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another dynamic we see here, and I'm really interested in both of your perspectives on this, is states have adopted different sets of laws post 2020, and there's this is speaking in rough terms. There's a divergence. There are some states that have worked to make voting easier and increased early voting, increased access to mail-in ballots and things like that. And some states have made it harder in various ways. And I don't know whether you think that that's going to be. That means there's different conditions on the ground in those states. But is there any problem with that overall divergence, or is that just going to kind of work itself out?
Well, I'll let you take the lead on this from the constitutional perspective.
Well, I'll say, I mean, this is one thing both parties seem to agree on is that higher turnout always benefits Democrats. And the problem is they're definitely both wrong on that. We have tons of evidence to prove that that's wrong. Texas and Florida had the highest turnouts they've ever had historically, and they had the widest margins for Republican candidates historically. It is just simply untrue. One of the other things, and I've done research about this over years, is voters are highly complex individuals. They vote or don't vote for a variety of reasons. They vote for who they vote for a variety of reasons. And it is really hard through legislation to dictate outcomes.
Right.
But one other thing that's definitely true is whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, passing laws to try to create a certain electoral outcome is personally, I think, not in the best spirit of our democracy. But even more importantly, it's not going to work. It's going to fail in every single case. And that is because voters have 1,000 different factors working on them. California has some of the easiest voting laws in the country, and yet they're in the bottom 10 in turnout. There are many reasons for that. New Hampshire has some of the toughest voting laws in the country, and they're always in the top 3 or 4.
Yep.
So I think a lot of these laws, whether they're coming from kind of the Republican side or the Democratic side, or worse, from the election denial side, and we saw some of that. Places like Texas, places like Florida that passed some really poorly thought out laws. They're often going to make the election process more difficult for voters and just as difficult for election administrators. There was just a story on NPR about how their mail voting law changes are really going to make it difficult for Florida's supervisors of elections, the majority of whom are Republicans, to manage that process. And they're almost definitely not going to have the kind of desired effect that legislators want in terms of driving their own party to power.
So there are a couple of dynamics here. One, and I've talked to a lot of Republicans about this, and they will say to me the following: well, look, my constituents think there's something terrible with the system, therefore it has to be changed. I'm like, what do they mean? Well, the election was stolen. I'm like, you know it wasn't stolen. I know that it wasn't stolen, but my people believe it was, and I have to be responsive to them. I'm like, you could try to talk them out of it. No. I can't try to talk them out. It's too close to the bone for them. They really believe it, and they want me to do something about it. So that is a bottom-up dynamic, and I always remind them that there is that option A. Try to talk them out of it, or at least give them your perspective so they can counterbalance that and come to their own conclusion. But oftentimes they feel this overwhelming pressure to do something. And that's driven a lot of state legislative changes. Now, another dynamic that I think is important to note from my position in the media, we need to do a better job. Yes, we can report what people say about things, but not every change to every law in every state is suppressive. Just because someone says it's suppressive doesn't necessarily mean it's suppressive. And just because you are making voting easier doesn't mean that's a path to fraud, even though people will say that. And we're duty-bound to report what people in positions of power say. We also need to try to contextualize these things. And one thing that David and I very much agree on in this entire conversation, separate from the 2020 election, just about voting law changes, fraud and suppression are used too much, and they cloud people's actual understanding of what these changes are. Oftentimes, these changes are at the margins. They're incremental. If you go from 21 days of early voting to 18, is that suppressive, or is it a 3-day difference? Well, it depends on your point of view, but it's not proof that it's suppressive. 18 days of early voting is still 18 days of early voting. It's different than 21, I grant you, but is it suppressive? Or if you go from 18 to 21, is that a floodgate to fraud? No, it's a 3-day difference, okay? And we have to be, and again, one thing I'm encouraged about is because it was necessary, not because we wish it were true, but because it was necessary after 2020, large news organizations have created democracy desks where you have national reporters who used to be like me, doing national political stuff and never paying attention to election administration, who now cover this as a beat and really dig into this and try to help people understand and print stories and make radio broadcasts on NPR and elsewhere to dig into this and to understand and to contextualize some of these conversations. And as we point out in the book, after 2020, some states made their voting comparatively more restrictive, but almost an equal number of states made their voting comparatively less restrictive. So it's not like the pendulum swung in only one direction after 2020. Guess what? Blue states made things a little bit easier. Red states made things a little bit harder.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I mean, my organization puts out every couple of years a kind of report on early and mail voting options. And maybe you'd be surprised to hear this, but 35 states allow anyone to vote by mail or vote early. How they do it, how many days, where they are, differ, but it's 35 states. Some of them are deeply red, some of them are deeply blue. There are only 4 states that don't allow either no excuse absentee voting or mail voting or early voting. And those are New Hampshire, Connecticut, Alabama, and Mississippi. They're not monolithic politically. Connecticut, that's going to change for very soon. And similarly, when you look at the Georgia law, for instance, which I should say, I mean, I did a lot of work on this. It was unnecessary. Georgia ran very good elections in 2020. In fact, their most successful election they've ever had. Georgia had been, for the previous 2 decades, had no paper ballots statewide. They used what's called direct recording electronic devices, which some people in Tennessee use and only a very few people elsewhere use. And they switched to all paper prior to 2020 in a bipartisan move. Worked incredibly well. They somehow recounted over 5 million presidential ballots in a matter of just a few days. That was possible because they had the paper ballots. But nevertheless, the legislature passed this unnecessary bill, SB 202, had a lot of unnecessary, not great things in it, had some stuff that was okay. The side that passed it wants to say, see, this created all these good things, and the side that was against it says, see, this created all these negative things. The fact is, post-election 2022, Georgians are much more confident in their elections, and yet almost none of them attribute it to the law. It was because of other things, right? Because they had a good process.
And,
very few lines.
Huge turnout in 2022.
I mean, and this is something that, looking forward, we're going to keep seeing, is that the effort, what trend I'm really watching is an effort by election deniers to use the language of election integrity to try to dismantle the infrastructure of election integrity. Things like, I'm sure you've heard efforts to encourage hand counting of ballots. Right. Hand counting is a wonderful way to count ballots if you want slower, less accurate, and really expensive counts. It's a really bad idea, and one of the reasons it's so bad is because our ballots in the United States are very long and complex. Dozens of races, many pages, really hard to hand count. Machines count things much, much better. Humans are bad at that kind of repetitive thing. Now, do those machines need to be checked and audited? 100%, and they are. 43 states and DC have audits. Another thing we're seeing is attacks on a data center called the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC for short, that the states use to keep their voter lists up to date as people move. They share data with each other to see if people move within the states or between states, to see if people died, and helps them keep their voter lists up to date. And now extremists are attacking that. Now the question might be, why do they want a less accurate count? Why do they want less clean voter rolls? And I actually don't know the answer to that. But it might be because they actually want to create more chaos post-election that would enable people who lost the election to claim there was something wrong when there wasn't. This creates volatility in the post-election landscape that would open the doors for things like political violence, which is obviously something we talk about in the book quite a bit because it's something we worry about quite a bit.
Nye County, Nevada is an interesting place. They decided to try to go through this hand counting process this year. And what did they find out? It takes forever. It's really hard work. And it's super expensive. I could give you 2 examples of where hand counting ballots really work. When a family wants to vote on where to go to the restaurant, that's one. And then I'll give you one from my professional experience. So I don't know how many of you know this, but on September 11th, 2001, I was with President George W. Bush in Sarasota, Florida. Wow. And with 5 networks, we're covering that president's trip. It was the second day of a 2-day trip to Florida on education policy. Of course, no one that morning expected anything like this to happen. And the way that in a breaking news situation, networks decide which network gets on the air first is there's a baseball hat. And there are 5 strips of paper with a number written on it. And we put those 5 strips of paper in a hat, numbered 1 through 5, and we pull that out of the hat, and whoever gets 1 is the first one on the air. I was working for CNN at the time. My producer, not me, pulled the first piece of paper, and it was number 1. So I was the first person on the air on any television network in America on that morning, not because I was the best journalist in that room. I was pretty good, but not the best. But because we pulled our ballot out of the hat. That's another place where hand counting of ballots works.
I bet the other 4 networks didn't think so.
No. But there was no time for a recount,
no audit.
We no audits, and we went on the air. So think about it this way. When you go to a great Tennessee company, FedEx, based in Memphis, and you put your package in, it's scanned. When it hits another part, it's scanned. When it hits another part, it's scanned, and when it's delivered, it's scanned. That's a scanning of a barcode, that's a scanning of a set of numbers that verifies it every step of the way. That's how voting works. Are you angry about your FedEx package? No, you have a high degree of confidence that your FedEx package is going to be delivered. Why? Because you believe that scanning is a verified mechanism to reinforce it through the steps. Pick it up.
I'll just say, so we got to be careful. That's the envelope. They don't know how you voted on those.
Of course not. No, right.
The scanning of the ballots is a separate process that is only occurs after everything's been validated. But how many people, probably in the summer around the Arizona primary, started seeing things perk up on social media about, gee, France hand counts all their ballots right away after the election. Why can't Arizona? Why can't these other states do it? Did anyone see that kind of stuff? It was very popular. I have to admit, I didn't actually know how France conducted elections. They run a variety of different elections, so I started researching this. France's presidential election was one race on the ballot, the same ballot for everyone in the entire country, with one race. Literally, you picked a different piece of paper depending on who your candidate was, and you put it in that envelope. That's pretty easy to count. Imagine counting a 10-page ballot with 80 races on it. By the way, with a place like Los Angeles County, California, has 5,000 different ballot styles. That means different pieces of paper, depending upon what your political geography is. And they run elections in, I believe, 19 languages. So there are 19 different versions of that. No human being should have to count that, right? And that would take forever. We'd never meet our constitutional deadlines with regard to the presidency. We have very complex ballots. There's reasons for that. We enjoy direct democracy, most of us, as American citizens. Some people think we have a little bit too much, but we'll leave that debate for another day. But whether we have too much or just the right amount or not enough, our ballots are long and complex. And there's no way to count them immediately 1 minute after the election is over. And that's particularly true in Arizona, for instance, where one of the campaigns actually encouraged their voters to drop their ballots off at the last minute. You can't start working on a mail ballot to validate it until you have it in your possession.
Right.
And if everyone drops it off at 6 or 7 p.m. on election night, it's going to take longer to count those ballots. And that's just, and that was actually the campaign doing it to themselves, again, attacking election integrity under the auspices of election integrity.
Yeah, this is really great. Let me pivot to a couple of things. There's some reform proposals you make in the book, and you've got a whole list of them, and I admire them so much because they seem like they would make a difference, and they're also pragmatic. And so you suggest, of the list of reforms, you have protection for election workers, increased federal grant funding for states to run their elections, limiting sore loser lawsuits, and also making sure that there's continued accountability for those criminally culpable related to January 6th. And so I wonder, which of these do you think is most important today, or which is there a group of them you'd pick together if you had to pick your bit, and just tell us a little bit about why you
I think
so?
David and I would agree resources matter a great deal, and underfunding elections and election administration places the entire system under more stress than it needs to be. There were allocations of money during 2020. How much again was it, David?
Do you remember that Mark
CARES
Zuckerberg granted about over $400 million?
No, but I mean, the federal government put some money in the CARES Act.
Yeah, in the $400 million.
In 2020.
Yeah, that's about $1.50 per eligible voter in the United States. The last two federal budgets included $75 million. That's literally 25 cents per eligible voter in the United States. It's not enough, especially as more requirements are being placed on election officials.
Yeah, and I think it's self-evident why if you make a specific threat to an election worker, that should be a sanctionable crime. And this is one of those aspects of American life where when there's no history, we don't have a remedy. We've never had to, what? And I will tell you, in many instances, right after 2020, local law enforcement didn't even know what to do with this. Like, what are you talking about? People are calling in and doing what? They're leaving messages where? What is this about? There was no training about this. There's no seminars on this. There's no roster of state and federal laws about threatening election officials. We had simply had no experience in this space at all. And local law enforcement, even federal law enforcement, the FBI is like, what? We don't even know jurisdictionally who's got this. What are the statutes? What are we even investigating? So we need to be specific about this. We need to say, okay, if you're an election worker, you can get an angry phone call. That's fine. We should record those calls. Have a mechanism by which everyone, look, if I call my bank or I call my insurance company or I call Whole Foods and they tell me this phone call will be recorded for customer protection, which isn't true, let's have recordings for calls that come in to election officials. Just automatically, so people know, hey, you want to come in to call and make a threat, you're going to be recorded, and that's going to be part of the established record. If we can do it for consumer protection, I think we can do it for election worker protection. Then we ought to have penalties that are specific. Say, don't do this. We want to deter this kind of specific behavior because it's so foundational to the way we do this thing that we do, which is the furtherance of our democracy, the furtherance of this constitutional republic. And the way that is furthered is by having reliable, predictable, safe, and verifiable elections. And these are the people who make that work happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think all of these things are important. Protecting election workers, the threats are real. There have been well over 1,000 passed on to the Election Threats Task Force that the Department of Justice, FBI, is running. Not enough prosecutions yet, only about 5. Hopefully that will pick up. I talk to election officials all the time. I've seen some of these threats either by text or email or heard recordings of phone calls. Sometimes they threaten the election officials themselves, but just as often they're threatening their staff or their facilities or their families or their spouses or their children. Imagine getting a text with the names of your children and a picture of their school.
Yeah, that's a sanctionable crime, in my opinion. That's a crime.
And it can be. So these are the kinds of things that are still ongoing, and there absolutely need to be some protections there. The funding is absolutely necessary. That's really important. We mentioned the sore loser lawsuits. This is, again, accepting the rules of the game by the time the game is played, right? There's things you might not like. You might not like mail voting. You might not like drop boxes for mail voting, even though that's the most secure way to return a mail ballot. You might not, as a mail voting, by the way, something that was really perfected by Republican campaigns for a long time, and it tended to be more Republican for most of its history. You might not like a variety of different things that happened, but if you don't like it, bring a lawsuit, bring your evidence, go to court. Republicans won 7 out of 8 cases. There weren't only 8 cases, that's just the percentage. 7 out of 8 cases pre-election in 2020. You don't hear about that very often. They knew the rules. Both sides knew the rules on Election Day, whether they liked them or not. And for sore loser lawsuits, what we're really proposing is that anyone who brings a lawsuit about a rule that they knew or should have known about before the election should be prevented from bringing in a claim post-election when they lost under those rules. But I think the single most important one of the recommendations is the accountability for those that have spread these lies, who have incited anger and division and violence. And right now, the incentive structure is very out of whack. The people who are at the top of this pyramid spreading the lies are getting rich. They are lining their pockets with small donations from people who are good Americans, but who are sincerely disappointed about the outcome of the 2020 or 2022 elections. They're targeting their own, they're fleecing their own flock. These people are victims, and it's a part of a large grift. But that incentive structure is very out of whack right now. We have a lot of empathy for the victims of this ongoing grift. If you read the book, you'll see that, I hope. Now, I'm also hopeful that we're going to see a change in that incentive structure probably this year as more and more accountability is had, more and more people are brought under criminal charges, more and more civil liability. Rupert Murdoch was just deposed a couple of weeks ago in New York on one of the lawsuits against Fox News. We are seeing more bar proceedings. The California Bar is instituting proceedings against John Eastman. Rudy Giuliani has been brought before the DC Bar for proceedings. This kind of accountability is essential to change the incentive structure so that people will no longer look at this as a get-rich, not even quick, it's going on forever. It's going on for over 800 days. We talk about Sidney Powell. I don't know if you remember, she got sanctioned by a court in Michigan in 2021, about $200,000. She had raised $20 million in the first few weeks after the 2020 election. That's a pretty good profit margin overall. So that's what we're talking about with accountability. That needs to end so that people who might otherwise allow themselves to be corrupted, act corruptly, or corrupt others will have to stop and think about it.
That's great. The book itself, I almost had my own reform proposal coming out of the book, which, the book itself is an act of public education, as you can see from all the resources we're hearing today, and so much of it actually makes me feel so much better and more secure about our system. But that then leads to the next step, which is, what should we be doing in high schools? I kind of feel like if we all knew more of what these two gentlemen know, we would have a better basis to really take stock of our election system. And so it's almost, I think, I don't know the extent to which high school civics is taught, but I almost feel like what I want out of this, one of the things I could see coming out of this book would be almost a curriculum for America about what our election mechanics look like. And do you think that would be worthwhile? And what do you think, what would you want every American high schooler to know?
So one of the most overused phrases in American life is teaching moment. Oh, this is a teaching moment. Well, January 6th is a pretty big moment, and we can use it as a way to sort of explore things and say this is an unerasable moment in America. It will never go away. It will never, ever go away. The images of people storming the Capitol, full of rage, full of a sense that, as many of them have said in court papers and in interviews subsequently, my president, our president, told me to come there. I thought I was doing what he asked me to do. I believe in many cases people did get caught up in a sort of mob mentality. I want them prosecuted for the crimes they committed, but I do understand the psychology of thinking they were doing something right and in retrospect coming to a different conclusion about that. And we have in the book several letters written by those writing to the judge in their case seeking mercy and sort of going through the process of reassessing everything they did, why they did it, and how they were wrong, in their own words, not my words. That's why we put these letters in the book. It doesn't matter what I tell you about what they thought. It matters what they tell you about what they thought and the journey that they've gone on. But it's a moment to sort of unspool some of these things. And I think if you've got to teach this moment in every high school in perpetuity, and it becomes a means by which you say, here are some of the fundamentals about how we do this basic work. What does the Constitution say about elections? Time, manner, and place. Who's in control of that? Each state. Each state is in control of time, manner, and place. It's in the Constitution. That's a basic civic starting point. And then we go through, what were the controversies? What were the disputes? How were they resolved? And we have, let's put a couple of pages in every history book about this very process to prevent every high schooler like me for just thinking this is what happens. We have elections, and they just go on, and all we care about is the results. No, let's spend a little bit of time figuring out what the process is, how intrinsic it is for America to continue, that Americans who do this work be allowed to do it, explain how it happens, and protect them while they do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think there's another angle I'd add to, which is something that has occurred to me, because it's something we can all do, every single one of us. It is easy to look at people we disagree with and tell them that they're wrong. It is hard to be critical about our own beliefs and our own perceptions. It's hard to be a skeptical and critical media consumer. It is hard to get out of our silos. There are tens of millions of people in this country who live in silos where COVID is either a hoax or it is a weapon, who live in silos that believe that any election that their side loses has been stolen. And by the way, there are silos on the other side of the political spectrum that also exist. By the way, sometimes those silos meet at the bottom. I will tell a little story where I myself found myself victim of this. I consider myself a pretty savvy media consumer, which is dangerous to think of oneself that way. I don't know if you remember, but several months ago, Lindsey Graham appealed the order that would have required him to sit for testimony in the Fulton County, Georgia case to the Supreme Court. And the way those appeals work is they go to the Supreme Court justice that oversees that circuit. That justice happened to be Clarence Thomas. And Clarence Thomas stayed that order, not requiring Lindsey Graham to go and testify right away. And my immediate reaction was, oh, for F's sake. Like, when are these people going to be held accountable? And I started feeling the anger brewing in me. And then I took a step back and I realized this is the way it always happens. What Justice Thomas is saying is this is important enough for the whole Supreme Court to hear. We're going to let the Supreme Court hear it. And ultimately, they heard it, and they decided to require Senator Graham to sit for testimony. That was entirely appropriate. Same thing happened, by the way, with Justice Kagan doing the same thing, staying it temporarily, holding it. But this is very common. We probably each have an experience every day where we go on social media and feel the anger churning inside of us, feel the outrage, the righteous indignation. And we recently heard a term that was shared with us. We didn't invent it by any means. The term is rage farming. That there are people whose livelihoods, their job, the product they create is rage inside each and every one of us. And I do think this is an aspect of civic education we need to increase. If we're feeling rage at something we've read, first of all, it might be legit. I mean, but we should all take a moment and take a step back for a second. Question the source. Question whether the product is the rage rather than the ultimate outcome. Because I think this is what's allowed us to get to this point where thousands of people could attack the United States Capitol on January 6th chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." And then there are people after the fact trying to deny that it ever happened or that it was a peaceful protest.
Let me jump in with one last question here, which is, we've got, it's a big and broad country, and there's a lot of diversity, and that's part of our beauty for sure, and the diversity in elections, which makes it more complicated. So maybe you could just leave the audience with, what's one thing that gives you the most hope about our American project and our democratic project?
So, for this book, I did a lot of reading about two eras in American life, full of intense dispute, the Civil War and Vietnam. Civil War stands by itself in our history. A conflict that went through nearly 25 years of attempts to reach a legislative compromise that was unsuccessful and had to be fought through the bullet and the bayonet. Nearly 700,000 casualties on both sides, a 4-year battle that touched almost every part of the known geography of our country. Could not be resolved any other way because it had an underlying issue that could not be compromised: slavery. People writing about the conflict in America during the Vietnam War, I was born in 1962, so I have a recollection of it that is informed principally by the fact that I had two cousins who served in Vietnam in the United States Army. Both came home. But I remember putting care packages together for them with my mother and watching the evening news very relentlessly. Many of you will remember the evening news of that era. It was very hard to watch, and there almost became a formulaic recitation of the number of American dead and wounded each day in Vietnam. And people who are very smart at that time wrote that the country, by the late 60s, there were protests all over the country. There were bombings on college campuses. There were strikes, people not showing up at work or not showing up at school. The Pentagon was surrounded twice, massive marches. We were as divided, we were at each other's throats in no way since the Civil War. Okay, so I spent a lot of time reading about both those periods of time to inform what I would conclude about this period of time. And was it better, was it worse, was it the same? It's different. And here's my optimistic reason why it's different, and different in a better way. Our history tells us we could not have ended slavery without the Civil War. We tried. We tried. Kansas-Nebraska Act, Missouri Compromise. Lots of smart people tried to work it out. We couldn't. We had to fight over it, and a lot of people died. There's no other way to get around it. And the only way to end the conflict that tore families apart, my family was torn apart over Vietnam. My sister became very estranged from my parents over Vietnam. It was a huge dispute in my dinner table. And my brother sort of sided with my sister. They're much older than I was. And they were fraught and furious about this. And my parents could not understand their two children and their friends on this question, even though we had family members fighting. The only way to resolve that was to end the war. It had to do that one thing. We have a conflict over elections now, but the problem doesn't actually exist. We don't have a structural problem. We don't. We don't have slavery. There's only one way to resolve that. Fight a war. Who's going to win that? Who's going to win that ultimate question? What about Vietnam? Are we going to end the war or not? Once we ended the war, things subsided. This conflict now is about a structural problem that doesn't actually exist. That's why I'm optimistic. It will take time, but the truths in this book will not yield. They are not going anywhere. And the deniers are running out of breath and explanations. And these truths, to quote someone much more famous than I am, justifiably, let facts be submitted to a candid world, that's where they are. And they're not going away. We don't have a structural problem. We're actually, as David said earlier, doing this better than we've ever done it before. That's not going to go away, and that will not yield. And we'll come around. It'll take us time. Sometimes this country goes in fits and starts. But we'll come around. And we'll come around on this question, and we'll rediscover that thing that we justifiably, as Americans, take pride in. Locking arms, innovating, doing things well for the common good, and making this a better country.
Great. That's fabulous. Well.
Sorry, a little bit of sermon there. I apologize, but
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Major Garrett and David Becker, for making the time to have this important conversation with us here today. There are copies of the Big Truth that are available in the lobby, and Major and David will be off the side to sign a few copies, and for a short period as well. So I look forward to welcome you all to the next university event, and if you can please join me in thanking these two gentlemen. Thank you all.